lecture series of the Center for Research has been a significant academic initiative over the years. It has hosted distinguished scholars in the past, such as Professor Davidson and Padma Shri Professor Varinder Chauhan, and we are extremely delighted to take this initiative forward by continuing this tradition of rigorous and interdisciplinary academic engagement. At the Center for Research, our annual lectures focus on interdisciplinary themes, encouraging conversations that cut across disciplinary boundaries and engage with contemporary questions in a meaningful way. Today's lecture is very much in that spirit. It engages with the critical and extremely relevant theme of global vaccine inequality. In the post-pandemic world, this discussion remains extremely important as questions of equity, responsibility, and global cooperation continue to demand serious attention. Before we begin, I would like to invite our dignitaries to please join us on the dais. Could you please move towards the stage? Ma'am, please. May I request our respected Vice Principal, Ma'am, Professor Jyoti Singh, to please address the gathering.
Namaskar and a very good morning to one and all present here. It gives me immense pleasure to warmly welcome you all to today's important and thought-provoking session on politics of global vaccine equity. This topic is not only academically relevant but also deeply connected to the ethical, social, and political responsibilities of our global community. At the outset, I extend a heartfelt welcome to our esteemed speaker, Dr. Renu Singh, Associate Professor, Durham University, United Kingdom, who has graciously accepted our invitation to share insights on the subject that has reshaped global health governance and international relations. Your perspective on vaccine issues, access, power dynamics, and equity across nations will surely enrich our understanding and encourage critical reflection among our students and faculty members. I also take this opportunity to extend a warm welcome to our session chair, respected Professor Balram Singh, President, Institute of Advanced Sciences, USA, whose guidance and scholarly experience will help steer today's deliberation in meaningful and engaging manner. Sir, we are very grateful for you to for your kind consent to moderate the session. It was only after COVID-19 pandemic that the issue of equal access to vaccine arose. It is not just a medical issue, but also a political, economical, and ethical one. The issue of global vaccine equity has highlighted inequalities between nations, raising urgent questions about justice, policy making, and global cooperation. Such discussions as these are essential. Why? Because they help our students to explore beyond textbooks and also engage with the real world challenges. I'm confident today's session is going to be intellectually stimulating, and it is going to inspire us to think critically about health equity, global politics, and our collective responsibility towards global community. Once again, I warmly welcome you all, our distinguished speaker, respected session chair, faculty members, and dear students, and I wish all the success to the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your warm, encouraging, and insightful address. I now take this opportunity to briefly introduce our session chair for today, Professor Balram Singh. Professor Singh has been closely associated with the Center for Research, as he also delivered a special lecture earlier under its banner. It takes us great delight to welcome you again to Maitreyi College, sir. Thank you so much. Professor Singh has been a professor since 1990 with the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. He was there until 2014. He's currently with the Institute of Advanced Sciences. His research spans an exceptionally wide and interdisciplinary range, including work on tetanus neurotoxins, vaccines, antidotes, drug delivery systems, as well as studies on yoga, mind and consciousness, and Ayurvedic biotechnology. He has an extensive publication record with over 16 books, 450 research articles, 20 patents, and close to 1,000 seminars and conference presentations to his credit. Professor Singh also plays an active editorial role in academia. He's editor and associate editor of several journals, including Biochemical and Biophysical Research Reports and the Ayurveda Journal of Health. He's the editor-in-chief of Vedic Waves, the online blog of the World Association of Vedic Studies, and the general editor of the Ayurveda Health, Happiness and Harmony book series published by Motilal Banarsi Das. Given his deep engagement with biomedical science, public health, and knowledge systems, we are especially grateful to him for chairing today's lecture on the politics of global vaccine inequality. Thank you once again, sir. It's a matter of great honor and pleasure for me to introduce our guest lecturer for today, Dr. Renu Singh. Thank you so much, ma'am. Dr. Renu Singh is Assistant Professor in Comparative Politics and Public Policy at the Durham University, where she's based in the School of Government and International Affairs and serves as Program Director of the MSc in Public Policy. She holds a PhD and MA in Government and Political Science from Georgetown University and an MS in Public Policy and Administration from the London School of Economics. Her educational qualifications are extremely exhaustive because Dr. Renu Singh also holds a BA in Political Science alongside a BSc in Microbiology from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Dr. Singh's research examines the interaction between political institutions, public opinion, and policy change, with a particular focus on public health, science policy, comparative social policy, and global health governance. She's an associate member at Nuffield College, University of Oxford, a scholar at the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law, Georgetown Law University, and a DAD research ambassador. Her work has been widely published and engaged, and she engages both in academic and policy communities internationally. Thank you so much, ma'am, once again for coming. We have students today. We have students today from life sciences, sociology, and political science present amongst us in the audience. So we are hoping that your session, your lecture in particular, will be extremely useful. And I'm positive that you are going to witness a very healthy and active interactive session. I now invite Professor Balram to please conduct the proceedings as the session chair. Before I hand over to you, sir, a small announcement for our audience members. We encourage active participation, and the student with the best question during the interactive session will receive a small hamper, a small token of appreciation from the Center for Research. So once again, all the best. I hope all of you have an extremely stimulating session. And over to you, sir.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for this great introduction of myself also. The speaker, Dr. Renu Singh, is related to me, just in case some of you were wondering. If you didn't figure it out by the hair, just wanted to make sure that you know. But she has really quite independent-minded research quite independent thinking and pursuit of some goals of life. So this is not just a interest because he just did some work, but he really is very. I mean, this is one thing other chairs cannot say that I can say. She's really. I mean, I know her since she was born, obviously, but the thing is that she has been pursuing something that is of her interest, and public health is something that she very deeply cares about. So whatever she is going to talk about is really by her own interest and by her own heart. With those that brief my introduction, and I think we will have some interactive sessions after that. She just gave a talk somewhere where the interactive session was as long as her talk was. So it's going to be very interesting. I think students should be able to impart not only the knowledge but also question and get some answers to their maybe something that is not sure about. So with that, I would request Renu to take the stage and make her presentation first. Okay? I'll get out of the way and sit on that side. Okay, beta, you can go.
Okay, I'll just hold the mic so you can hear me. Um, I just want to very briefly thank, all of my hosts, the chair, and all of you especially for being here. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. So I want to give you, a good sense of this topic, but I also want to make sure we have plenty of time to kind of have a discussion and to hear your questions, because that's what I'm looking forward to the most, is to kind of hear your thoughts about this as well. So I'm glad that you come from so many different disciplines. So please feel free to kind of, use that to your advantage. And I tried to think of a topic that is also interdisciplinary, so that hopefully that brings, your interests and your passions into the discussion as well. So as you know, I'm a political scientist, but my background is in microbiology. And so I kind of try to bridge that science policy gap. And a lot of my research recently is on this important topic of the politics of global vaccine equity. And so I will, kind of just broadly give you a sense of, my interest in this comes twofold. One from, of course, wanting to have, better health outcomes for more people, the social justice aspect of it, but also an interest as a researcher in, implications for future global health emergencies, vaccines going forward, and also more broadly, the role of institutions in global governance, and how those interests can come together. And most recently, with the emergency with COVID-19, we saw, a lot of these issues coming up. And so that's kind of why I thought it's a topic that would be important to share. And also, you've lived through this, right? You've lived through this crisis, so you can bring that perspective yourselves into the discussions as well. So I'll start off by just kind of saying that I'll have two parts to the lecture. So the first, I'll explain a little bit of the background and the policy background to why I think we had the vaccine equity issues that we did, right? So you all must know, right? Not everyone got access to COVID vaccines when they needed it. Some still haven't had access, right? And it was very unequal in terms of the deployment of supplies, and in terms of the creation, even the manufacturing of them to begin with. And so the first half will kind of look at some of the policy and law landscape behind that. The second half will be more quantitative and look at some data of what people thought, bringing in the public and what their interest is in all of this. So to start off with, I'll talk to you about two competing policy paradigms and legal paradigms really for vaccine equity. And so, why did vaccine equity efforts, with the backing of many high-income countries, especially some of the world's most powerful governments, philanthropies, why did they, with a clear head start, even before vaccines were developed, people were having discussions about how we need to be equitable and how we distribute them when we do have them. Why did we then fail? Why did we not have that vaccine equity? And at the heart of this failure, I argue with colleagues of mine as well, that this lies in a policy paradigm poorly matched to the global political environment and to a global health policy agenda that excluded key measures that were more aligned with political realities. But before we get there, there is a success story, and I do think it's important to kind of remember and honor that, and then keep that and reflect on that as we go. And the success here was that we created multiple successful vaccines during COVID-19, and we created them in less than a year's time. Does anyone know how long it usually takes to create a vaccine? Any raise of hands? How many years? I'll give you that. It's not usually 1 year. Does anyone know? Definitely more than 2 to 3. What else? What else do you think? Anyone? Yeah. Yeah. An average? So closer. We're getting closer. So it can take 10 to 15 years. It can take 10 to 15 years on average to develop vaccines. Keep that in mind when you think about the fact that in less than a year's time, we were able to develop multiple, right? Multiple. So Russia, China, India, the US, UK, Germany, right? Several countries in the EU, we developed multiple vaccinations. Some were approved by WHO, some are still being approved, right? But within a year's time, these are remarkable efforts by public and private investments. Let me see if I can get that off, or I'm not sure actually how to get that off. Did I push something? Sorry, I'll keep talking while you're saying. That image. We'll just block them, or they won't be able to see maybe. It's just remarkable, right? That we were able to, as a kind of global society, develop such new advanced technologies, right? Including mRNA vaccines, of course. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So that's the success story here. Now, obviously, I'm here to talk about the kind of politics of why we then saw such failure, right? And so, not even quite a year, but within a year of vaccine deployment, 7.5 billion vaccines were administered worldwide, but nearly 3/4 of them were only in 10 countries. You can probably guess, right, which countries. And so Tedros Ghebreyesus, director of the WHO, he stated there's no diplomatic way to say it. A small group of countries that make and buy the majority of the world's vaccines control the fate of the rest of the world. So we very immediately, right, within months, unfortunately went from developing vaccines to not having access to these vaccines. And just to show you what this can look like, this is data that's available online. And if you separate countries by kind of low, lower middle, upper middle, and high income countries, you can very clearly see how many really were vaccinated. So the further to the right they were, the higher the vaccination rate. And the size of these bubbles, each being a country, is the size of the country. So obviously, India, China are kind of the two largest bubbles, but you get a sense of broadly all of them. And higher income countries clearly had more access to vaccines, right? And you kind of see that variation. So this is first year of deployment in 2021, but even a year later, so you see many more countries kind of having access, but we still saw this have and have not situation, right? We still saw a number of countries unable to vaccinate their people. And if you look at this also by region, So same data, but now where, not just by socioeconomic level, but by, region, where were we seeing this shift? So on the left, you see in 2021, very clearly, in Africa, just broadly in this continent, there was very low access. Barely 10% of their population was vaccinated, partially or fully. Whereas, US and Canada were, 71% of them had at least one dose. A year later, the yellow kind of brings in the story of boosters, and that's something I'll discuss with you a little bit later in the quantitative data. But at a year later, you then saw access to not only vaccines initially, but some countries were giving their populations boosters before some people even had vaccines at all in the world, right? To just give you a sense of the level of inequality we were dealing with and why this really became something that mattered and bothered me, and which is why I kind of have this research agenda where I was trying to figure out what we could do about it, what happened, and where can we go from here. So this again is just showing you similar data, but since I, only could show you those initial 2 years, if you wanted to know what happened going further, unfortunately, right, you still see that pattern. This data goes until 2024. At some point, obviously, we're not taking vaccines as regularly, so I didn't show you up until now, for example, but you can see that low-income countries are quite far behind high and upper middle income countries, even years out, right? Years after the acute phase. We're still, dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. It hasn't gone anywhere, right? But the acute phase was over. We still see this inequality. So as I said, my kind of thought behind this is, why is this happening? Was this idea of the two policy paradigms, right? And in order to kind of understand what that means, I think it's important to think of what brings something on the global political agenda. And what does that? There are kind of three things to keep in mind. First, getting on the agenda requires the strength of certain actors involved and their interest and their ability to kind of focus on this. Second, the ideas used to kind of portray an issue, how you frame an issue really matters. And third, the political context matters. So we'll have a look at all three. And ultimately, I theorize that there are two competing policy paradigms that kind of explain what was going on with the COVID-19 vaccine equity efforts. So one paradigm, I call this demand and distribution paradigm. The second is an open supply focused paradigm. So I'll kind of walk you through what each one means, but this division is really at the heart of the limited equity achieved in terms of vaccine equity. The fact that both could have been complementary, but were pitted against each other and very much came from opposing parties is at the heart of why we saw what we saw happen. So the demand and distribution paradigm, this focuses more on kind of market-based solutions. So the focus is on voluntary action by pharmaceuticals, by states, by governments to ethically distribute limited supply. So you want to think of this as focusing on demand and voluntary action by states and firms. And this paradigm accepts basically that there was artificial scarcity in terms of how many vaccines we had based on a fixed supply. So you can think of, say you have a pie. In this paradigm, instead of making more pies or having a bigger pie, they decided this is the pie. This is what firms that have developed vaccines say they can make. And the issue then is for us politically, how do we evenly distribute this pie? But that didn't have to be the problem, right? So that's why I say artificial scarcity. They accept this artificial scarcity. So instead of worrying about dividing a limited pie, imagine a world where we just enlarged the pie. Imagine a world where there were just more vaccines to go around. And so that wasn't the key issue. The key issue was how to enlarge that pie, as opposed to just share as much of it as you could, whatever you have. So the open supply focused paradigm accepts that vaccine nationalism is inevitable, that people are going to want vaccines for themselves, for their country, for their region, et cetera, et cetera. And everyone's gonna demand that. So we should just create more to deal with this demand. Because also, of course, everyone wants to survive, right? That's makes sense. So this advances, solutions focusing on opening knowledge and expanding supply by allowing for a larger pie to be made. So that's kind of the two paradigms that you saw. And that second paradigm focuses more on national and international law as a kind of solution to that, as opposed to just pharmaceuticals and states making vaccines. So the demand and distribution paradigm, I'll just kind of map out for you how early these develop. So March 2020, if you remember, where were you in March 2020? How old were you in March 2020? Yeah, you had just started, but how old were you guys? Were you in third year, fourth year? I'm hearing a few. Yeah. So remember where you were. Try to think back to where you were at that time, quite early on, right? So at that time in March, the convening of the G20 leaders, they were already discussing this issue of what are we going to do when we have vaccines. We didn't have vaccines yet, right? We barely knew COVID existed, that it was there. We started to, there were lockdowns, but leaders were already discussing that, 9 months before the first vaccines would be approved, they were discussing that we need to figure out a way to get everyone vaccines. By April, so a month later, they created the Act A, the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator. This was at an event co-hosted by, the President of France, the European Commission, WHO, the Gates Foundation, so a mix of countries, philanthropies, institutions. And they created COVAX, the vaccine pillar. COVAX is the institution that was meant to promote vaccine equity and really structurally handle that issue. And they said that their aim was to guarantee rapid, fair, and equitable access to vaccines. So the aim was there, the goal was there. Ensuring that people in all corners of the world will get access to COVID-19 vaccines once they're available, regardless of their wealth. So we all know a few years later that this was a great aim to have, but unfortunately we failed, right? We weren't able to get that level of equity for everyone. What I want to highlight here is that the primary incentive in the system was for high-income countries to procure vaccines through COVAX. So we didn't have vaccines yet, so they were going to kind of use COVAX as an insurance policy. If we don't know which vaccines will be effective, why don't we pool our resources, de-risk any chance of investing in one or the other and then they fail. Maybe Pfizer would have failed, but I don't know, a different, AstraZeneca would have succeeded. We didn't know at the time. So to try to avoid any risk, they said pool your resources, and once one of them succeeds, we'll evenly distribute. I'll come back to that. So that's kind of why I emphasize that as being the logic they used. We're going to pool resources, especially from high-income countries, the ones who are especially investing in this, to de-risk the situation. That's a problematic assumption. I'll explain later. But at the same time, the other paradigm was working. So that became the dominant paradigm, the first one I just mentioned, the demand and distribution paradigm. But there was a parallel paradigm that focused on vaccine equity and enlarging that pie at the same time. March 2020, again, the president of Costa Rica proposed a memorandum of understanding among states, focusing on sharing of technologies, and by May, the presidents of South Africa, Pakistan, Senegal, and Ghana wrote an open letter calling for the agreement, expanding on this memorandum of understanding. And later that month, the WHO and national leaders actually launched CTAP, so the COVID Technology Access Pool. And by October, South Africa and India were leading in proposing changes to intellectual property norms, saying we should waive IP rights, as we have done in a previous pandemic. Does anyone know what other pandemic actually still exists aside from COVID-19? Any guesses? Close, but no. Starts with the same letter. I appreciate the guesses though. So HIV/AIDS is a pandemic still today in its 4th decade, right? But in its most acute phase, we did waive IP rights to give access to drugs that were helping people, right? So this is something that was being proposed that we had seen work before, especially South Africa, right, had been very acutely in a serious kind of acute phase of that pandemic. They were especially affected. And so, India and South Africa led on that, knowing that this had happened before and we had found a solution legally to handle the situation. So these both developed in parallel, is my point, and yet they were, instead of being used to be complementary to each other, they were pitted against each other. And so that kind of inherently is the problem. So why did one paradigm become dominant? There was kind of a lack of a real venue for negotiation. There were just multiple. It's not that there wasn't any. Obviously, you have the WHO, you have COVAX itself, you have Gavi, which develops vaccines. You had multiple locations. You had the EU, you had different regions even. But they were negotiated in parallel, but not always in the same place. And that made it very disjointed. It also meant that certain parties could emphasize what they thought was right in certain venues and kind of ignore other venues. And the open supply focused paradigm was also opposed to pharmaceuticals and companies, opposed by rather pharmaceutical companies and other stakeholders, right? Because that would have required them to renounce a kind of profit, right? It takes a lot of effort and money to develop drugs and vaccines, so they have IP rights for a reason to protect that development. But in a crisis situation, they didn't necessarily want to waive those rights, whereas certain parties thought it was worth that, right? And so they were blocking that side. And especially certain Western governments blocked action there because that tended to be where these pharmaceuticals were. So that's kind of what we saw. So again, why did the dominant paradigm fail though? So we still could have had success there. You didn't necessarily have to have failure. Why did we see failure, even if we wanted to keep to that small pie? So first, COVAX law and the political agenda, based on preferences of its main political sponsors, was focused again on voluntary interventions by companies and donor governments, kind of meant to organize that production of vaccines. And really, what I'm trying to say here is they were hoping that they would just kind of have, they would have this charity model where they would feel like they could, share vaccines that they could otherwise buy for themselves with everyone else. It was voluntary, right? There's no pandemic treaty at this time. So we have one now developed that we're trying to, ratify, but there was no way to kind of push actors to share vaccines once they had them, and not all actors had them. Secondly, COVAX fundamentally misconstrued and misidentified the incentives for IAM gun countries. So they were offering a solution to these countries that had vaccines that they didn't have. They actually had plenty of money to buy all the vaccines, right? Canada bought 5 times the number of vaccines that they needed, right? Israel, the UK, a number of countries in the EU, they bought multiple times the number of vaccines that they needed. So they didn't have a problem of vaccine access, and so expecting them to behave differently wouldn't have worked when they had no issue of money, right? They didn't have an issue of money. Secondly, they built in an incentive to defect. Does anyone know the percentage of vaccines that every country was supposed to have initially? 20, yes. 20 is correct. So they initially COVAX set that all countries should get 20% of that pie, that small pie. If everyone gets 20%, we're fine. But if a country can buy multiple times the number of vaccines that they need for their country, do you think they're going to just limit their people to 20%? Of course not, right? Vaccine nationalism is real. Whether or not we think it should exist is a separate question. Realistically, it exists, right? So we should have thought about that. Think of an alternative. Think of whether we had set that rate at 80%. If 80% had to be the base for everyone, we would have realized that we needed to enlarge that pie. We would have thought of that second paradigm. That's the problem, right? So they built in an incentive that just led these countries to obviously not follow. And so that combined with, weak norm building and soft international commitments, we didn't have a pandemic treaty, we didn't have hard law, we didn't have a stick, right, to kind of keep countries in line with an agreement or an understanding. We only had suggestions, we only had carrots to give them. That meant that there was no way to kind of secure them in having this enlightened self-interest. And we had no mechanisms to punish anyone for bad behavior. The last thing I'll say about that is also there were domestic incentives, right, that we should have considered. So leaders of high-income countries were talking about international intentions to share. Of course, they were, there were several speeches by Biden, by the, Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission had, by a number of leaders, Macron in France, et cetera, right, saying that, yes, we should make sure everyone gets access to vaccines. But at the end of the day, they needed vaccines for their people first, right? They're elected officials. Their people wanted vaccines, and they needed to, they decided that they needed to vaccinate their own first. They were not honoring that 20%, right, that one of you mentioned. So that's the kind of broader kind of legal policy context. So what can we do about it? So I can talk to you about why we failed, and it's important to understand that so we can work towards success. But it's not a particularly happy story, right? So I want to walk through some quantitative data and show you maybe by the end maybe what we can do about this next time. So I did some analysis in 3 high-income countries: Germany, US, and Italy. 2 of these are vaccine producers, right? Germany and the US were vaccine producers, a BioNTech Pfizer vaccine. Italy is a high-income country that wasn't a producer, though, so I think it's important to kind of see what they would say otherwise as well. And so I'm going to show you what some of the questions around vaccine support, I'll show you what some of their public basically thought. I ran some surveys in these countries to try to understand what the people would say, not just politicians, right? Not just pharmaceutical companies, not just policymakers or regulators, but actually the people. So despite vaccine equity then being the problem, we've kind of established if we wanted to end the pandemic, vaccines were the answer, right? The problem. There's been a lot of resistance to actually, addressing this. And, even the strongest, highest profile vaccine equity effort, COVAX, reached less than half of its goal. So they had this goal by 2021 to distribute 2 billion doses. They were not able to even do half of that. Further, political leaders have cited the constraints of their public as being why they had this kind of vaccine nationalism, as to being why they kept vaccines for themselves. So given this context, I'll ask 3 questions. 1, what is the overall support for policies for vaccine equity? What did people say? What did Germans, Americans, Italians say? Right? 3 kind of groups of high-income country people. Second, who is more likely to support these policies? Or what kind of an American or German or Italian would support policies versus not? It helps to understand what's the kind of person, right? And then third, in terms of what we can do about it, can different frames affect support for such policies? So in the policy literature, there's this idea that when you care about an issue and you want to make a change, how you frame the issue matters. How you present it to someone who can make a difference matters, right? So I'll show you 2 ways that you could have framed vaccine equity for people to try to convince them to support it. And then I'll show you what their effect was. So in order to do this, I ran 3 surveys. I ran this during the kind of Omicron surge, so January 2022. Again, think back to where you were. You've lived through this. There was an Omicron surge at this time. Boosters were coming in for the first time in some country contexts. So I asked some questions about demographics, about vaccine equity policy, government spending, and racial resentment. And also I ran this experiment to get at that framing question. And so for the experiment, for the framing, I first prompted respondents on how sharing vaccines to help end the pandemic is in their national self-interest. So the framing was, this is in your interest. You should do this for your own selfish reasons, kind of. And the second, I prompted respondents on how sharing vaccines to help end the pandemic is more fair. So you could either tell people you should support getting vaccines to everyone because this is a fair thing to do, social justice, right? Or you could say, look, if you don't do this, you could get sick. Everyone could get sick. We could have more waves, right? This is in your national self-interest. You should do this for your own reasons. Neither is inaccurate. You should do it for both reasons, probably, right? But some people are more convinced one way or the other. So I wanted to see if you would see any variation there. So in terms of measuring vaccine equity, so for some of you that are more quantitatively oriented, when you have an idea and you want to try to do some analysis, right, you want to think about, how could I measure that? What does it mean for me to care about vaccine equity policy? So I thought about that. And these were some of the outcomes that I measured. So first, I asked people about their kind of overall support. So do they want the government to do more to make vaccines available? Just a general statement about, do they care that their governments do more? Second, I asked, would they support the sharing of technologies, so that other people could manufacture the vaccine? Third, I asked about donating vaccines. So the first stage, the ones that you could take yourself, would you support this or not if you knew other people needed it more somewhere else in the world? Second, I asked, would you donate extra vaccines? So slightly different. Obviously, extra doesn't make you feel like you're sacrificing your own, but still, how many countries had extra vaccines? So it was important to ask, especially in Germany, the US, and Italy. They all had too many vaccines. Third, boosters. So remember, we're in the Omicron phase. 2022 boosters were starting to come into play. So I also wanted to ask, look, if you at least got some vaccines and someone else got none, would you at least give them the booster or not? That's another way to kind of get at that measure. So I look at this in the US, Italy, and Germany, and I've explained a little bit as to why, right? Two are vaccine producers, two are not. But also, I picked them because they're different, right? So the US has a two-party system, has a very set federal system. Their public health systems are also different. Italy is more unitary, but has federated healthcare. Germany's federated, but Italy and Germany don't have a two-party system. They have multiple parties. And all of this has a role, right? The kinds of when you're trying to get something on the agenda, the kinds of political actors involved matter. So I wanted to see some variation in that. But also, they all obviously went through COVID-19. They are all advanced industrialized countries with greater access to vaccines. So I wanted to ask this of people who maybe had some of the most resources you could have in the world. And then also think back to vaccine nationalism. I also wanted to pick countries where it was very clear that there was vaccine nationalism across the public. So I wanted to get at what that means then for vaccine support, for support for access for everyone. So I'll show you then the kind of average mean support for policies across the countries to answer that first question about overall support. I'll also look at the correlates of support for policies with the combined sample of all three countries to get at who really is more likely to support these policies. I build an index to do that. And then finally, I'll show you some analysis from the survey experiment to see which frame maybe made the best or worst in terms of convincing people. So overall support. In principle, most people want their governments to do more. So you can see here, it's pretty popular to just say, should the government do more to help with access to vaccines? Yes. Should we give extra vaccines? Pretty high, right? Most of these indicators are above 50%, which is quite high in terms of support. Considering how we failed, why are so many people supportive then, right? In theory, people are supportive. But this does vary by policy. So boosters, people were the least supportive, probably because that's what people needed the most at the time of the survey, right? So actually you see there's a bit of self-interest here. And also support varies by country. So the Italians are in green, and you can see they're kind of the most supportive overall, maybe because they didn't have access to vaccines, right? So you can get a sense of a country that maybe doesn't have access to vaccines will be more supportive of vaccine equity because they receive more from something like that. From being supportive because they're thinking of maybe themselves. I mean, there's a lot you could think of. This is just the kind of demographic data to show you. So who is more likely? What kind of person is more likely? So I combined these samples, I ran a regression model, and I have a number of independent variables. Some are more demographic, so what age groups were more or less supportive, what gender, what type of education. If you have family who are abroad, maybe you think more about vaccine access because you think of other people that you're related to. But also ideology. So I am a political scientist at the end of the day. So I was interested in, if you're more left-leaning or right-leaning politically, does that affect your support? If you're more open to kind of supporting welfare policies or foreign aid policies, does that mean you're more or less supportive? Also, if you kind of have what I define as more racial resentment or not, does that make you more or less supportive? So if we look at the data here in aggregate, you can see three kind of main takeaways. One, ideology does seem to matter, right? So you can see the three bars that are at the most right show that left-leaning kind of welfare supporting and foreign aid supporting respondents, people, were more favorable towards vaccine equity policies. Having said that, you also saw a role for self-interest here. So if you look at the very top, people who are more elderly, more vulnerable to COVID-19, wanting those vaccines, they actually seem to be less supportive. And also those with foreign family, which is right at the bottom, family abroad, they seemed also more supportive slightly, right? Which kind of makes sense. It was in their self-interest. You're thinking of your own people. You're thinking of your own family. There also seemed to be an empathy effect. So people who knew someone who died of COVID-19, they were slightly more supportive. So there's something maybe going on there as well. Now, in terms of, this is harder for you to see, so don't worry if you can't read the words. It's more to show you the different colors are the 5 different policies I mapped out for you, right? So you can see here that there's variation. Even if I overall can see those patterns, there's clearly variation across the different types of vaccine equity policies, right? And that's really what I want you to see here. And then again, to emphasize that self-interest still shows up. So the elderly at the very top again were most opposed to giving away boosters. So that's that orange all the way on the left, or the green, so to donate initial vaccines. Again, because understandably, they were the most vulnerable. Also, ideology measures matter the least for donating boosters and shots. So those middle three, the left ideology, welfare support, and foreign aid support, you see they're over, but there's variation. And again, the orange, the boosters are the most to the left, meaning that really what the takeaway here is, it implies that there's self-interest because those policies, getting boosters, for example, would be the most costly for a country fighting an acute phase of COVID-19. So when push comes to shove, someone on the left, someone who's maybe more progressive, someone you think is more about social justice, et cetera, broadly speaking, they're not that much more supportive to give away something that they need themselves in a crisis context. Doesn't make you a bad person. I'm not putting a normative judgment, but just to understand how people behave, and then what can you do about it? So then the main takeaways here are, in aggregate, ideology matters a lot. And there's some evidence that self-interest matters as well. However, there's kind of explanatory power of variables across the different policies for vaccine equity, and that variation further illustrates the importance of self-interest in shaping some of these policies. And the reason that's important is this last question. So what are we going to do about this? So if we know this could be a situation again, say there's another crisis, say there's a surge in COVID again, but a new mutant, and we need to again develop a vaccine. What, are there certain frames that could convince people more or less potentially to support vaccine equity? So again, here I have these two vignettes. I had these prompts. Respondents were randomly either assigned to the one prompting them about self-interest or prompting them about fairness. So that's really important. So they didn't both see that. And then what you see is that overall the treatment effects are weak, but the point I want to emphasize here is that the treatments, saying that it was in your self-interest or saying that it was about fairness, they're statistically different from each other in the combined sample and in the US. And that really shows that, there is framing an issue, and how you frame an issue makes a difference, right? And generally, the self-interest frame increases support, and the fairness frame reduces that. And this is important because both of these frames have been used, right? So one of the famous lines in the WHO was, "No one's safe until everyone's safe." Right? That was something that people kept saying, no one's safe until everyone's safe. So how you frame something and how people perceive an issue is important. And this is important because it shows that, on average, you're going to have more luck persuading someone if you tell them it's in their self-interest versus telling them it's fair. Not that it's not important to tell people that it's fair, not that it's something we shouldn't do, but if someone's not convinced by that, try to convince them anyway, right? Because ultimately that's more fair. Maybe I'll skip this for now because I want to have more time to chat with you. But we can talk about this. Basically, I wanted to look at whether you're more left or right leaning, whether that'll have an effect on which frame works. And the self-interest frame did resonate more with right leaning individuals. So maybe I'll just say that. However, there was also a backlash among left-wing individuals, and that's not something I expected, but something, to keep in mind kind of as we think through how to frame these issues. So then ultimately, overall, people were generally supportive of the vaccine equity policies across the three countries, but there was variation in terms of the costliness of the policy. Ideology also shapes support for vaccine equity policies, but was tempered by self-interest. And in general, the self-interest frame increases support more than the fairness frame. So if you want to convince someone, that seemed to, on average, make more of a difference. And what does that mean? So I just want to leave you with a few takeaways. What can we do about this? What does this data really help us do in real life, right? So it shows that messaging is important, right? So messaging should maybe prioritize beneficial mitigation effects of vaccine equity. How can we, what it's useful for, over concerns for social justice, not because we don't care about social justice, but you can ultimately have that social justice and vaccine equity if you can convince the people who are more self-interested that it's also better for them, basically, right, to care about vaccinations for everyone. Also, let's not forget that TRIPS waiver, the story about HIV, and then, India and South Africa really pushing for waiving of IP rights, people were supportive of that. So why didn't politicians, waive IP rights? Why didn't they let other people manufacture? So here, of course, in India, we had the Serum Institute, right? But what about other places? What about South Africa? What about Thailand? They had the ability, but they were not given the information. But people in high income countries seem very supportive of that. So they should push that agenda, right? They should push their politicians further. And we should remember that. So then finally, I would say that financial solutions alone will not address political problems. I mean, is it a surprise to say you can't throw money at a problem? It's not necessarily, right? But something to keep in mind here is money can't solve everything. And also, an international agreement committing states to share tech and support would be effective. And that's something that we've seen now a lot of people work on with the pandemic treaty, right? That's been being developed for the last several years. That's now in the ratification process, but was finalized kind of in 2025 in May. And then finally, global health policymaking needs a central venue for negotiation. We don't really have that. That's something we should think through for next time. Should it be the WTO? Should it be the WHO? Should we have a different organization? Should we have more structures to that system? That's something to think about going forward. So with that, I will just say thank you so much. And I'm happy to take questions.
Do we have mic in the audience to take questions? Renu has covered quite a wide topics, from how long does it take to make the vaccine, and then what kind of culture and politics can play a role. India, I mean, the worldwide, of course, we kind of know what happened, but India is also in the midst of all this. India actually supplied, Serum Institute supplied a vaccine for other manufacturers, and so, yeah. So questions, do we have questions? Okay, great.
Good morning, ma'am. I'm Ashi. I'm a second year political science student. Firstly, it's an honor to be in the same room as you, and I think everybody right now has something valuable to take from this seminar for sure. My question to you is, do you think the COVAX initiative that you talked about of 2020, it, as you mentioned, it depended on the charity model. So do you think it tackled the problem of vaccine inequity in a meaningful way, or did it eventually just legitimized this system where the global south countries depended on the powerful or the richer countries for their, like, on their goodwill or their donations? And what do you think could have been the potential solution for this problem? Like, should there have been legal obligations on these countries to sort of not engage in bilateral advance purchases of vaccines? Or, like, I would love to know your take on this.
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, I would start off by saying, yeah, this charity model, right, that we were talking about. I mean, just think of, you guys could probably answer that. So when has charity been a good policy model? Has it ever? Can we think of an example where that is the only? Not that it's a problem to have social justice and charity as a piece of a situation, but to trust that in especially a crisis situation, that asking countries with resources and also risk of their own to be charitable, that's just unrealistic, right? It's just very unrealistic. And you're getting at that in your question. You're getting at exactly what the answer would be, right? It was just, we didn't have enough hard law. So hard law versus soft law, right? Hard law is like having a treaty or a kind of resolution where there's some kind of binding agreement, right, between parties, countries, whoever it is. Soft law can be like guidelines saying it's a good idea to do this, we should aim to do this. Both are important, but especially, again, in a crisis situation, clearly we need hard law, right? Clearly a charity model is not going to work. We've seen it now, but I think we could have known it before. Having said that, we at least have seen it now, right? And so we do need to have more binding agreements. Now, the pandemic treaty has tried to, be some of that. It's not the first time we've wanted to have that. Honestly, I would say the people I know some of the people who are in the room designing it. Actually, one of them, he's based in Delhi, and he's honestly always going to Geneva back and forth for this. Um, but it's not enough, probably, in the sense that remember that anything at the UN is consensus based. What does consensus mean? Does anyone know? Consensus means everyone has to agree. Can I get all of you to agree to any one thing in this room? Think about how hard that is. And, we're very similar. Like, you're similar age, you're all students, you kind of want to represent, there are more incentives for you. You're all, this is an all girls college. There are so many things that are similar. Of course, you're all very different, right? But imagine different countries, different people, from different backgrounds, from different socioeconomic backgrounds. Trying to convince them all to agree on anything is really hard. So as much as I, critique the UN and critique the WHO, and this, is me saying COVAX failed, it's hard to do what they do, right? And I think ultimately a solution is also resources. So the WHO, their budget is like equivalent to like a large hospital's budget in like New York or probably Delhi or something. You know what I mean? Like they don't even have the resources, and what resources they have are often earmarked or set aside for certain projects. So they, if there's a crisis, cannot all of a sudden take that money and move it towards a crisis. So there's a funding issue. Even though I've said don't throw money at a problem, we should throw some money at this problem. There's not enough money being thrown at this problem, but also you do need really legal, hard law to make that happen.
Good morning, ma'am. I would like to ask, in the case of India, the booster dose were primarily given to the working class. So how could have India ensured the equity in distribution of booster doses to the general public as well? My name is Priyansh.
Thank you, Ranchi. So your question, let me just make sure I understood, was that in the distribution system here, it was given to working class people, but obviously there are a lot more people that needed it. So I can say that, often, so I was actually in Hong Kong. Hello? Yeah, I was in the US initially, but I was vaccinated in Hong Kong because I was a professor in Hong Kong at the time. And I've now paid attention to the system in multiple countries because I literally lived that. I lived through the access in the US, the access in Hong Kong, the access in Italy, and now in the UK, right? And so I was in those places and moving around them when I was getting vaccinated. And yeah, essential workers were like, especially among the kinds of workers you're talking about, essential workers that had to run basic systems, post, food supply, mail, et cetera, doctors, teachers, were given it. I was given it first in Hong Kong because professors were part of essential workers because we were still required to teach in person. So they put us in that list. But that varies, right? What every country decided to be essential was also slightly different sometimes. And another kind of related, I think, question that I would add as a response is, once we got past that group, who was eligible, right? That's a whole question. And I think understanding what priority list you have is the solution to that. It's tricky though, right? So for example, in some contexts, being predisposed to like asthma, having asthma or respiratory issues or certain issues that could make you more prone to getting COVID or having a very serious case was the reason why you would be next, right? But that wasn't also clear across countries, here and otherwise, right? So for example, if you were overweight or obese, like you're supposed to have priority, right? But some people resisted that, saying, well, that's a behavioral issue. Why do we allow someone to have priority if they have that issue? And then there was a whole ethical debate, right, around who should have priority, whether it's a medical reason, whether it's a kind of work reason, whether it's some other regional, right? There might be certain outbreaks. And I would say that it has to really be a system that includes all of those. And the best solution is to kind of, the field, if you're interested in this, that you probably would want to be in is epidemiology, right? So if you decide you want to go into really being the person who tracks that data, epidemiologists are often the people in departments of health locally and nationally, right, that are sitting there calculating the numbers, prevalence rates, risk. But if you care about the kind of beyond the medical situation, maybe that's like an economist or a policy kind of person that would have to make that decision. And going forward, I think the biggest issue I would say across all countries was that those two groups weren't talking to each other. And really to make the best decision, those two groups have to talk to each other to understand what socioeconomic backgrounds, what health backgrounds, and what other kind of ethical issues are involved or economic issues are involved. And it's not maybe the most satisfying answer to say, but I would say that to me is the core as to why we didn't have the clearest policy, is those actors in the policy space need to talk more to each other.
Hello, ma'am. I'm Reba, third year Pol Science student, Pol Science honors. And first of all, I'm really honored to be in your presence. I think everyone is definitely. So my question is that you framed it and you talked about it that self-interest matters the most in vaccine policies. So do you think it has impacted America's foreign policy today, the whole self-interest thing?
That's a tricky one, but important. So I would say, yeah, I mean, so it's tricky because it's a democracy and people who get elected change. So we had Trump at the beginning, but then Biden came in. So during the rollout, right, January 2021, Biden's inaugurated completely different policy, right? And so that's why actually political ideology mattered to me. That's why, I mean, that's why I'm a political scientist, right? I care about health, but I've realized increasingly politics matters for it. And you saw the rollout for themselves, at least, to be the same. So I would say broadly, the US was still more self-interested, right? And I would say, as you should expect any country to be. Now, we don't always expect that. We do expect the U.S. to be less self-interested. Think about USAID and these foreign, kind of policies that they've had to help others for so long. So we actually have an expectation that they, of all countries, wouldn't do that. Now, unfortunately, now we're in a situation where some of the most prominent, most effective, most kind of U.S.-centered foreign policy issues on this area are completely upended, right? So USAID has existed forever, well, not forever, but like decades and decades. No one ever thought that institution would be gone, right? And it's primarily health-oriented. USAID's aid, foreign aid in general, tends to be mostly predominantly health-oriented, and that's been upended, right? And unfortunately, not only in the U.S., thanks to the current administration, but unfortunately, we didn't see that pattern end there, right? So the UK responded by doing something similar, even though they're not on the right, technically. Labour is in office right now, but they also reduced severely their aid. So we're living in a world where I would say there's like extreme self-interest in that, in political science terms, is isolationist, right? Kind of anti just trade agreement, anti-aid agreements, and I mean, I think that's the end to your answer, but I would say, just to not leave it on a sad note, I think what that means going forward is, let's remember that these aid institutions, as important as they are, were still somewhat broken, right? They often would swoop in. USAID is known for like swooping in, not talking to local partners, trying to make something happen, leaving. Sometimes that ends up working long term. Sometimes they just temporarily fix things. I think the long-term solution is to have local state capacity. And fortunately, the silver lining to an otherwise bad situation for me is now we have the incentive. We, being the rest of the world, has an incentive to build that in a way we didn't if the U.S. foreign policy was less self-interested, right? So let's take that as an opportunity, hopefully, to strengthen our own systems.
Good morning, ma'am. I'm Shachi from Pol Science Department, third year. My question is, has the global response to COVID undermined the legitimacy of WHO and multilateralism?
Sorry, can you just say that again?
Ma'am, has the global response to COVID undermined the legitimacy of WHO and the multilateralism?
Yes, I mean, I would say definitely yes. Oh, so there's two pieces. One, WHO, 100%. So I have a chapter on this in a book that, and I often was the one in a room complaining about the WHO up until recently. As a kind of global health scholar, you often go to the WHO and tell them what they're doing wrong so they can fix it. And I was put in a weird position where when Trump was first leaving or proposing to leave the WHO, I was like, wait, we're not that upset, right? We're not so upset with things that they do wrong that we shouldn't try to strengthen their system. And I think, unfortunately, COVID and the response, and they weren't perfect in their response, right? There were several issues. So yes, they have a lack of resources, and yes, they don't have the kind of strength that like the WTO has in terms of hard law. If you come back to the first question, but they delayed, right? So they initially were very favorable to China's response and everything, and giving them all these accolades for their lockdowns. Probably because they felt like that was the only way to get the access to the vaccine and the information they needed. But they were criticized for that because actually we probably shouldn't be that supportive of what China did initially, because obviously we all got COVID because there wasn't transparency, right? So they were criticized because they play this role where they're scientists who need to make decisions to get access, or need to make decisions before saying you should mask or you shouldn't mask, and they won't do that until they have all the evidence. But then they're also a political body, right? So you have to be careful if you say something to any one country, China or otherwise, because it's a diplomatic setting. Also, yes, you should maybe be careful and not tell people to mask or not mask, until you know and have all the data. But when it's a crisis and people are dying, you need to tell people faster. And they're really stuck, and that's always been an issue, but in a crisis it becomes more obvious. And we're definitely undermined. And unfortunately, that has snowballed into multilateralism also, being undermined. I think again, a takeaway from your question, I think we should still support them. I think they should be an avenue for negotiation. I think they need more resources, and they need people who understand this science and policy kind of divide. But, have they been undermined? Yes, definitely. Thank you.
Yeah. Good morning, ma'am. I'm Avika Singh. I'm a second year political science student. I have a question to you that given the ideological divide you mentioned, do you think that's the reason that Indian vaccine policy could not give it the kind of leverage that was expected out of it?
Sorry, remind me of the first part of the question.
Given the ideological divide that you mentioned,
Yeah.
do you think that that's the reason that Indian vaccine policy could not give it the kind of leverage that was expected? out of
And when you say leverage, what was expected?
Yeah,
Just let me ask you a question first.
like the how to explain it? Like
Do you mean the role of like Serum Institute, or do you mean the role more broadly of their leadership?
in leadership also you can say in that.
Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, I have to think about that one a bit, but I mean, I would say that. Thank you for that question. I would say that yes, it's tricky. I mean, I would say unfortunately we live in a world where India and is no exception in seeing increasing polarization, right, among just everyone kind of. And I think that health issues haven't always been polarized, but we just went through a health crisis. That tends to be when we all freak out and come up with opinions and maybe connect them when an issue gets framed. So that idea of issue framing, right, that I mentioned, fairness versus self-interest. So an idea comes of age when there's a problem, usually. And then it's all over the news, and it's what we're all talking about, and we're trying to find a solution. And that's usually when an issue then starts to be taken by certain parties or stakeholders or political groups, and then starts to be more associated with them, right? And so COVID-19 did that as well. And so that, yes, I would say that does also kind of explain some of the deadlock we see. And you see this with other issues. I mean, just to give you an example of another one, obesity policy. I mean, why would it be controversial to help, manage a normal situation that's just a health condition? But think back to, will you guys be old enough? Were you guys alive when Obama was president? Yes. Sorry, I lose track of how old everyone is. So Michelle Obama, right, the first lady, did not think it was controversial to just be like, oh, kids should have a nice lunch and run around. I mean, she thought, first ladies in the US, the standard is they pick some nice issue that means something, makes people happy, and you talk about it, right? Like, she did not think she was making a political statement. It became very political, right? Like, it became very political. And I've done interviews in like Wisconsin, and they've banned the word obesity in their state parliament. And they've not let their Department of Health people in there because they've said it too many times. Like, I met all of the people involved, both sides, and they even told me I should change the name of my book to not have obesity on it, right? Like, to be wellness or something, because it's too controversial. Like, same kind of situation here, right? Where like an issue that seems like it's just a normal, objectively medical issue, policy wise, we have solutions that maybe should be involved. And all of a sudden, people are like, I don't want Michelle Obama telling me what to do with my kids' lunch. And, the government shouldn't be telling me what to do with my kids' lunch. It's like, okay, I mean, we didn't care when there were like school nutrition policies up until now for decades, right? But now we do. And I think with vaccines, it's similar, right? And India's in that sense, no group of people is really immune to that in a world where we're becoming increasingly polarized. So that's what I would say. I would say that I do think that rift explains a lot, especially today more than ever. Polarization is, even broadly speaking, outside of even just India, but also here, like increasingly something we see in society.
Greetings, ma'am. Greetings, sir. Myself, Pragya Jain, and I'm a second-year student pursuing BA Political Science honors. So my question is that you concluded by saying that there's a need of central venue for negotiations for future pandemics, right? So what, according to you, can be the ideal characteristics for such venue? Can it be the existing venues like WHO, WTO, or something? We need something new out of it, or how can the how can the UN or the major global countries like USA, China, India can influence such venue?
Yeah, so that's two important questions. I'll try and be brief because I know there's many of you, and I keep getting into these very good questions. But yeah, I mean, I would say you mentioned the two venues that I think are the most central. I think the WHO needs to be strengthened and have more, maybe more of a model like the WTO that has the ability to kind of have a little bit more binding law, right? But also the WTO matters for health, right? As we've seen with the TRIPS waiver. And so I think that those two institutions to me are probably central in terms of being able, so at the World Health Assembly, they meet every May of every year. That should be a central venue for kind of discussions and negotiation about this. And we should work towards strengthening that. And now I've forgotten the second half of your question. Sorry, it was...
It was about the influence of the global powerful
Oh, right.
countries.
Yes. Yes. And I think that, so that's related. And what I would say there is, when the UN was developed and all these things were developed, think of who's on the Security Council and who is not. It's very clear who the powers were at that time, right? These great powers, as we call them. I think we need to have more. Clearly, there are more powers now than there maybe felt like they were then. Maybe, and so I feel a little uncomfortable calling them powers because everyone has a power of their own, right? But that's a term we use in political science, great power politics, right? So if we're going to use that term, there is certainly, just using that definition, more great powers, including some of these countries that you mentioned, and they need to be more centrally part of this. And again, coming back to when I forget now your names, but there was a question about like U.S. foreign policy, and I was talking about foreign aid and U.S. aid. So again, it's an opportunity. So U.S. aid isn't here anymore. There's no one to look to in terms of the way we always look to the hegemon, the way we always look to the U.S. It's not there anymore the way it used to be. And it's not really clear that there's anyone else to look to. There isn't really, right? So I think that's an opportunity for these other powers to say, we need to take on some of this ourselves. We need to be responsible. We need to be strong actors. Being a great power also comes with great responsibility, right? And I think we can take what is otherwise a very bad issue, this like demise of USAID, to be an opportunity to bring forth other actors now who really we do need, right? They have the power to make a difference. Who has the mic? Or should I just?
Okay, I think one last question. I'll just take one last question. We've run out of time. I'm so sorry. So we have space only for one question. And yes, I think then we'll just move towards the closing of the lecture. So sorry.
Good morning, ma'am. Good morning, sir. My name is Bhumi and I'm from Physics Honors. Ma'am, as AI has introduced to us so many technology and research as well, do you think with the help of AI, we can get the vaccine sooner? And with the help of this, the middle income countries get the vaccine in affordable and accessible range?
Yeah, so what's the role of AI maybe in helping with this situation? I mean, I do think AI can make a big difference. So especially with something like epidemiological modeling and the response time we need to know what the need is, AI can be very helpful, right? But also just research across disciplines. So in terms of vaccine development, in terms of vaccine deployment, there are a number of areas where I think this could be efficient. The one concern I have is the politics, right? So what I've said, I think AI can get us to knowing what the problem is faster and having solutions faster. And that's really good. I think the problem is you have to then turn around and convince politicians. Unfortunately, I haven't found a way that AI can convince politicians to do what you want yet. So that's where we'll still need you, right? So I think that's a great kind of last question. I think this new technology that we have brings a lot of promise and gives us more, of a means to explain why it's such a pressing problem to the actors involved. But keep in mind some of the discussions we've had today about the other issues around it and use that to then convince them, I would say. All right, I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of you, but thank you so much for having me. And this is my first time at Delhi University, and I'm so glad you could be the first college that I get to spend time with. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Apologies to the students. We were not expecting, or maybe we were perhaps expecting, this is Maitreyi after all, such a fantastic response. Thank you so much, ma'am, once again. And a big applause to everybody here, actually, for taking the time out and for engaging with so much enthusiasm. Before we proceed forward with the names of the students with the best questions, in fact, everyone, honestly, before we make the announcement, did a fantastic job. It takes a lot of effort, lots of courage. Also, I feel to come forward, put your hesitation aside and ask the question. So, and it's basically the response from all of you that encourages us and everybody else to continue with such initiatives in the future as well. So before we announce the names of the students, I would like to invite Dr. Aditi to please deliver the final vote of thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before the final vote of thanks, I would like to invite Sir to give the concluding remarks.
Thank you very much. The reason I'm giving concluding remarks because there were so many interesting questions. So otherwise, he had already concluded, and that was great. It's good to see that the students have so much interest, and you are the future. The couple of lessons out of this. One is, of course, the power of politics. So you cannot be away from power of politics. whether you want to develop the vaccine or you want to use it or you want to promote it. The second thing is, which I think is very important, there are some science students also here, is that the science always has to be advanced. Even politicians need science, and that's why they call it political science. So if you were advanced, like, Renu said that 10 to 15 years for vaccine, a lot of it is politics. As you can see that the several types of vaccines were developed within a year. Even we have developed a vaccine, oral vaccine for vaccine, and we got the patent on 2022. So, but there is so much politics, and I have some, and I think she concluded, she realized the value of money. So you need to have the finance, even though that may be politics, but then nevertheless that you have to have. The last point I learned from this discussion is that something like pandemic can bring us all together. And we should realize that there are other things. The pandemic is so easy to understand. Need a vaccine, or even the flu pandemic, some of you probably don't even know, was 1918. And flu vaccine is still needed because flu is still going on. So will be COVID. We don't hear about that. I mean, the flu vaccine killed 50 million people. Sorry, flu virus killed 50 million people in 1918. The population was much less at that time of the world. We still, about 7-8 million people died with COVID. So there is always chance that something will show up in addition to continuation. So it's a good idea to have a lesson, as Renu tried to tell, that we need to learn the lesson of coming together, creating systems, including AI. If AI can help, that will be wonderful. And you are the future. So I hope that students and the faculty of the Maitreyi College as well as Delhi University will lead this kind of issues for the benefit of public and politicians. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Center for Research, Maitreyi College, I have the privilege of delivering the vote of thanks for today's insightful lecture on the politics of global vaccine equity. First and foremost, we extend our deepest gratitude to Dr. Renu Singh from Durham University for sharing her valuable time, expertise, and global perspective with us. Your talk helped us understand not only the scientific and public health dimensions of vaccine, but also the political, ethical, and structural inequalities that shape across the world. The clarity and depth of your insights have certainly left us with much to reflect upon, ma'am. Thank you so much. I would like to express our sincere thanks to our esteemed session chair, Professor Balram Singh, from the Institute of Advanced Sciences. Thank you, sir, for guiding the session. So thoughtful. Hello. Yeah. Thank you, sir, for guiding the session so thoughtfully and for enriching the discussion with your observations and reflections. We are also deeply grateful to Professor Jyoti, Vice Principal of the college, for her constant support and encouragement of academic initiatives such as this. Thank you, ma'am. I would also like to warmly thank all my colleagues and dear students who joined us today. Your presence, your questions, and engagement are what truly makes such academic events and gatherings meaningful and vibrant. Lastly, behind every successful event is a team that works quietly and efficiently. We acknowledge and appreciate everyone involved in the organizing and coordinating this event. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Before we conclude the talk, I would request Professor Balram and Dr. Renu to please felicitate the students for the best questions. Ma'am and sir, could I please request you to please come forward? The students with the best, the most interesting, I don't think I should use the word best, but perhaps the most interesting questions. Pragya from Political Science Honors and Bhumi from Physics Honors. I request the students to please come up on stage. Sir, if you could please come and felicitate the student. Bhumi, please. Sir. Thank you so much. And it was because of the questions that were being asked by the students right from the beginning of the session that we could create an ecosystem where students like Pragya, Bhumi, and others could come forward and think, reflect, and ask these questions. So once again, a big thanks to the students for their active participation. I would like to request the team to please come forward for a group photograph, to please come up on the stage. CFR team, members of the CFR team, I request you to please come up on stage. Just one tiny announcement for the students. We will be displaying the QR code of the